L'kutei Sichos Chelek Chav Beis Behar Aleph Lili Nishmas Yosef Ben Yamin Ben Reb Menashe Kaltman, an incredibly fascinating Sicha, where the Rebbe is going to bring various examples to the concept of even though a mitzvah is done properly, there is a better way or a more complete way to do that specific mitzvah, and it's going to actually introduce a chiddush, the Rebbe's chiddush, which the Rebbe is going to comment on at the end of the Sicha. Let us begin. Afin pasuk v'shavso ha'aretz Shabbos la'Hashem, as b'shana ha'revius, dav the erd ruin. The pasuk says that in the 7th year, the earth has to rest. And we don't do any agricultural work, of course referring to the mitzvah of Shemitah. Brengt der Zohar dem pasuk, ki sikne eved ivri, sheishanim yaved, in connection to the mitzvah of Shemitah, the Zohar brings the pasuk about selling or buying an Eved Ivri, a Jewish servant. Brings the pasuk that for 6 years he should work, and on the 7th year he goes free. And the Zohar says as follows: every Yid has a sense of rest in the Shemitah year. And the Rebbe teaches in Yiddish, in dem ruin von der Erd, darf euch die Knecht ruhen, that when the earth rests in the Shemitah year, also the servant has to rest. Ubegin kach, and therefore, uvashvius, in the 7th year, the Eved Ivri goes free. Bepashto zetuis. So when you learn this vort of the Zohar, it seems to imply, as the Zohar learned in Pshat, in Uvashvius Yetzi L'chav Shechinam, that the Zohar is understanding that when the pasuk says in the 7th year the Eved Ivri should go free, as das meint nicht im 7. Jahr von wenn is geworden an Eved. Seemingly the Zohar is learning that it doesn't mean the 7th year from when he became an Eved, nur Shnasa Shemitah. The Zohar is saying that since the whole world is resting, the earth is resting, and all the other Yidden are resting from agricultural work in the 7th year, so also the Eved Ivri should get a rest, and he should go free. Is bavusti tmiya, and on this there's a well-known question. As is a halacha revachas bekam mekemes bechazal. It is a widespread, a widely known halacha in various places in Chazal, as an Eved Geiter Reis Lachav Shinit Bishnas Hashmita, nor B'Shvis Lamechira, that the Eved Ivri goes free not in the 7th year, in the year of Shemitah, but in the 7th year from when he was sold or bought. What is the Zohar saying? That when the earth rests, the Eved rests. If it's it could be 2 different times. If the Eved was purchased in the 3rd year of the Shemitah, then when it comes to Shemitah year, he's only 5 years in. And it's not logical to say that the Zohar is arguing with all of these other sources in Nigla that Bashvius of the Eved Ivri means not the Shemitah. Clearly, the Nigla teaches that the 7th year of the Eved Ivri is not the Shemitah year. So what kind of limud is the Zohar learning here, where it seemingly is implying that the Eved goes out in the Shemitah year? To understand this, we're going to introduce something that we find with regards to mitzvahs. As es is farana kiyuma mitzvah in an eifin von lechatchila. There is the fulfillment of the mitzvah in lechatchila in how it's meant to be done in the best case scenario. And sometimes the mitzvah is done, literally the word means b'diavad means post facto, after the event. If it was done in a certain way, it's considered done. But in this case, what we mean to say is that the way that it's meant to be done, lichatchila, and there's a way that if it wasn't done properly, it's still considered that the mitzvah was done. Ukmavor ba'achreinim, and the achreinim explain, as ader chilik from lechatchila b'diavad is faran afilu ba'inyan deiraisa. It's not to say that deiraisa there's a lechatchila dikuei, and the Rabbanan came and said you can get away with the b'diavad. No, even by a deiraisa, sometimes there is a way to do a deiraisa b'diavad. Unochmer, more so. More than that, from the mitzvah tonight study. This concept applies not just to certain details in the mitzvah that would be considered as a secondary or a side thing to the mitzvah. Then you would say, I understand that since it's only a side detail, so therefore, if it wasn't done, it still doesn't affect the fulfillment of the mitzvah. But it's not like that. But the praten is in guf in a mitzvah. In some cases, this detail that we're talking about is part of the very fulfillment of the mitzvah. And nevertheless, it's a condition that does not is not totally required in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Which means to say, once the mitzvah was done, even if this detail was lacking, it's still considered a fulfillment of the mitzvah. And many examples are brought in the Achronim to this concept that sometimes you have a very fundamental detail of a mitzvah, and nevertheless, if it is missed out, if it's missed, it's still b'diavad considered the mitzvah was done properly. And one example that would be like the father of them all, which means to say one very well-known rule, dem klal by inyane kachim. We find this rule by kachim, by karbanis, shana hakasuv alav la'akev. The pasuk repeats it in order to say that this is a absolute requirement. And the example that the Rebbe is referring to here is a discussion whether the the cow that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur has to belong to him from his money, or it comes from the tzibur, from the communal funds, or from his fellow Kohanim. So the Gemara says that it says Asher Loi. Asher Loi teaches us that it has to come from his funds. Then the Gemara says, what happens if b'diavad he took the money from the other Kohanim? So the Gemara says that the words Asher Loi is said twice. Once it says Perek Tezayin in Parashas Achrei Mos, Perek Vav, V'hikriv Aaron es parachatas Asher Loi, and then again in Pasuk Yud Aleph it says V'hikriv Aaron es parachatas Asher Loi. Says the Gemara Shana Akas V'alav La'akev. The Pasuk repeats the Asher Loi again to teach me that this is a requirement, and if he went and he used the money of the other Kohanim, he's not Yaitza. But from this we see that if not for the second Asher Loi, that would mean that even though there's a requirement in the Torah that he should buy it from his own money, if he didn't, it would not be ma'akev. It would not stop the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So from this we see that there is a concept where even something that's a fundamental aspect of a mitzvah, but b'diavad, the mitzvah is still considered done and done properly, despite the fact that this detail is missing. Lei dem klal. Once we approach whatever topic it is with this attitude, this answers a number of different questions that we have, which a number of which will be brought in this sikha and will be explained following this rule. Uludugma, and the first example we're going to bring, which is going to be one of the main examples, but for something that's relevant in these days, which is right now we're in the Chodesh Iyar, and we're counting the Omer, and we find this concept of lechatchila and b'diavad in the mitzvah Sfiras Omer. Sfiras Omer is Dr. Pasuk. The Pasuk says that you should count from the day after Shabbos. Which seemingly means the day of Shabbos. And as the tzdukim, this group of people that did not believe in Torah Shebal Peh, they only followed Torah Shebiksav, they said, as atzeres achar Shabbos, that Shavuos is always going to be on Sunday. Why? Because they hold as men hoped on Seilen Sfira from the Machras Yom Shabbos. Because they hold you always count Sfira Sa'ima, you begin from Sunday. Even if Pesach was on Tuesday, still you would wait until the next Sunday to start counting Sfira. And therefore Shavuos, which is always exactly 7 weeks after the beginning of Sfiras HaOmer. So if you start counting on Sunday, then Shavuos is going to be also on Sunday as well. So they held that Shavuos is always on Sunday. Aber Teire Shebal Peh is mefarish, as Imachas HaShabbos and Imachas Yantiv. Teire Shebal Peh comes with a number of different limudim. Und wie Chazal bringen, der auf Kamer Reis with limudim, as Chazal in the Gourarie Menachos brings a number of different eyes. For example, it says in one place, Sheva Shabbat says Tmimos. Another it says Tisperu Chamishim Yoim, without saying the word Tmimos. So from this we see that there's two types of counting. So when you say Tmimos, that is when you start counting on Sunday, as we'll see weiter in the Sikha. But if you started counting on a Tuesday, it's still Yaitza, it's still accounting. And therefore, if Pesach falls out on a Tuesday, then you start counting on Wednesday. Another ayah the Gemara brings, there's more, but I'm just bringing two examples. It says, Tispar Loch, the counting should be for you. So the Gemara says, when you're counting from Sunday, then you're counting according to the Eibishter's weeks. When you start counting in the middle of the week, you're counting according to your week, so to speak. So from this, the Gemara learns that you can start counting even in the middle of the week. So this is a very well-known issue when it comes to Sfiras HaOmer, that the Torah seems to imply to start counting on Sunday, and the Tzdukim and the Baitusim Taka learn that you start counting on Sunday. Came Chazal and said, no, you start counting on the day after Yom Tov. Imachas HaShabbos doesn't mean Shabbos Bereishis, the Shabbos of creation. It means Yom Tov. And whenever Pesach falls out, every day of the week, you start counting Sfira on the next morning, on the next night, and the next day. So this raises a question. Since the Torah wants us to start counting the day after Pesach, why does Torah say Shabbos? Which leaves room for the error, as the Tzdukim and Baitusim did. Why doesn't the Torah speak it out more clearly and say from the day after Yom Tov? But Al Piyah now. But according to what we said until in the previous seif, that there's a concept of lechatchila and there's a concept of b'di'eved. Following this reasoning, we'll understand why the Torah says b'machas haShabbos and not b'machas haPesach. Ubahaktim. But let's elaborate a little bit on this. Just like with regards to the person's fulfillment, there is the way he can do it lechatchila, the best possible way, and then there's a way that he can get away with it, so to speak, once it was done. When he skips a detail, certain details are ma'akev, certain details are indispensable, but there's certain details that are not indispensable, and therefore if he misses those details, b'di'evet he's still yaitz the mitzvah. So that was with a person's fulfillment. That a person, it's better to fill it in a way of lechatchila, but if you filled it in a way of b'di'eved, you fulfill your obligation. Similarly, says the Rebbe, the same thing could apply in the mitzvah itself. As in gewisse matzavim is the mitzvah mit mer shleimus. In certain scenarios, the mitzvah is done in a more complete way, not the way the person is doing it. The person has no choice here. But nevertheless, the way the mitzvah is structured, in certain situations or scenarios, the mitzvah is done in a more complete way. Und es da am matziv, was die mitzvah is melechatchila ausgestellt in anefin, as in dem matziv tut man nicht die mitzvah b'shleimus. And certain situations, certain scenarios, put the mitzvah in a way that to begin with, it's done in a incomplete way. As fell in there by einige pratim, some of the details are missing, and yet you can't do better than that. In other words, it's not mitzad kiyum la'adam. It's mitzad the way the Eibishter structured this mitzvah. There are certain mitzvahs that certain details of them just can't always get done. It's done in a way, we're not calling it b'di'eved, because even melechatchila, it's meant to do it this way, as the Rebbe is going to explain. But nevertheless, it's not the perfect, most complete way of doing this mitzvah. The Gemara is a very basic, one of the very basic examples. Besides basically, is the Yom Tov with Gourarie karbanos. When the Beis Mikdash was standing, Yom Tov was connected with bringing karbanos. Karbanos Yom Tov Shel Tzibur, bringing the communal sacrifices, such as the carbon musaf, or the parei hachag, etc. When Shel Yachid, and also there were also private karbanos that were brought. Eilis Re'iyah, the Eilah that a person brought in honor of the fact that he came up to the Beis Hamikdash, and the karbanos of Chagiga, which was each person brought from their own. When the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we still have to fulfill the Yom Tov, min HaTorah. But on the karbanos, we can't bring karbanos. So it's not to say that when a person is experiencing Yom Tov in today's day and age, Mishachar Beis Hamikdash, it's b'dofen of Bidi Eved. No. He's doing everything he can do. He's doing the best he can do. Nevertheless, it's not b'shleimus. There's still an aspect that is not being done because he can't do it. Similarly, when the Beis Mikdash was standing, the din is that if someone didn't own real estate, didn't own land, he's patur from aliyah l'regel. We learn this from the pasuk, if you have artzecha, if you have land that belongs to you, then you go up for aliyah l'regel. So if a person didn't have karka, he was patur from aliyah l'regel. Melech when the karbanos yachid are now, and therefore he will also be patur from bringing the karbanos, such as the eilis re'iyah, because he's not being eilis regel. Even though he has to fulfill the Yom Tov. So a person, even in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, is fulfilling Yom Tov by doing all the other things that Yom Tov includes, but he didn't have to be eilis regel, and he didn't have to bring certain karbanos. So we see that the scenario dictates that if this mitzvah could be done bishleimus, in the most complete possible way, in the most perfect way, or if it lacks perfection. We can move on. Obviously, the karbanos were not a side detail in Yom Tov. Certainly, the aliyah l'regel. The karbanos are a nita mesuva from Yom Tov. Not only are the karbanos a side detail, the karbanos are not there because it's Yom Tov, but the karbanos are a part in fulfilling the Yom Tov in the most complete way, which is actually a drop different than the way we learned in the Sikha of last week or 2 weeks ago about Chag HaSukkos last week, about Chag HaSukkos, what makes the Yom Tov. But Lav Dafka it's a stira. In other words, Yom Tov, let's say Sukkos is made up by the fact that the Eibusher says today is Sukkos. But how do you fulfill Sukkos in the most complete way? With karbanos. Karbanos is a fundamental part of the Yom Tov. And nevertheless, if you can't bring karbanos, for example, it's Mishachar Beis Hamikdash, nevertheless, you're still doing Yom Tov min HaTorah. But it's lacking karbanos, it's lacking shleimus. Nevertheless, when you're in a situation that you cannot bring the karbanos, is the Yom Tov Ukdus Yom Tov Ben HaTorah. You have the Yom Tov Ben HaTorah. You have the sanctity of Yom Tov Ben HaTorah. That aspect doesn't change. So this is a very basic example of where you see that Yom Tov is established in a way that there is a more complete way of doing it when the Beis Mikdash was here, and there is a less complete way of doing it, which is when you can't bring karbanos. Noch mehr gefindman. If we're in, we veered off of Shemitah, and we veered off of Sfira for a moment. Now we're focusing on just explaining this concept of bishleimus and not bishleimus. We use the example of karbanos of Yom Tov, and then the Rebbe brings another example. Noch mehr gefindman. As eine von mitzvahs, was in der Chatchila gegeben geworden in Eifen, as es veran in der Mitzvah zwei Zmanim. Here, it's two scenarios. Previously, we brought two scenarios. The Rebbe says there's certain mitzvahs that actually the same mitzvah being done in two different times of the mitzvah is done into different ways. In Ein Zman is at one point in time, it is there with all of its perfection, with all the details. When in Zweiten Zman, in another time, it lacks this sense of perfection, or the sense of completion. For example, the days of Yom Tov and the days of Chalamayid. Chalamayid is a tale from Yom Tov. Is bichlal from Me'adim l'simcha un mitzad zeh mechuyev v'simcha min HaTorah. Chalamayid is a part of Yom Tov, and you're obligated min HaTorah to be v'samachta b'chagecha, to be joyful. Afal v'kein kumtis nitzu yimei Yom Tov atzmai, but you can't compare the simcha and the Yom Tov as it's observed on Chalamayid to the days of the actual Yom Tov. But then we'll just say Yom Tov Tov, where they got to shlemus b'chalapratim. which then it's a day of Yom Tov with all of the details. There's more of a simcha. There's much less of doing melacha. Even the Chalamayid also not supposed to do melacha, but you can't compare the two. In other words, clearly we're calling it Choil Hamayid. It's the intermediate days. It's the mundane days of the Yom Tov. So clearly it's not the same thing. So the Eibishter gave a mitzvah of V'samachta b'chagecha, and it comes out that there's certain parts of the Yom Tov where this V'samachta b'chagecha is more intense, and certain where it's less intense. Again, we see this concept of b'shleimus and less shleimus. That certain times is done in an eifin of shleimus, and at certain times, namely in this case Chalamayid, it's done with less shleimus. So now that we've established this concept that it's not just lechatchila and b'diavad, but it's also that the way the Eibishter structured, the way the Torah structures certain inyanim, that there's a way to do it with more shleimus and a way to do it with less shleimus. And when you do it with less shleimus, you're still fulfilling the mitzvah min HaTorah as you're meant to do it. And it's not even a b'diavad, but it's less shleimus. Now we're going to go back to the concept of Sfiras HaOmer, where we brought up the idea that there's Torah Mimachas HaShabbos, and the Torah really means Mimachas HaYom Tov, that any day of the week, whichever day Pesach begins, that's when you start the next day, is when you start counting Sfiras HaOmer. And we asked the question, why does Torah say it out unclearly, and say Mimachas HaShabbos when it means Mimachas HaPesach? But now that we understand that there's two layers sometimes in the fulfillment of a mitzvah, we'll understand that when the Torah says Mimachas HaShabbos, Torah is actually telling us something very vital to the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. Al derech zeh wird sein verstandig, wenn gets mitzvah Sfira. Das was Torah sagt, das war in der Mimachas HaShabbos, afal pi as the mitzvah von ein Sfiras till Mimachas Yom Tov, the fact that the Torah says the day after Shabbos, even though the mitzvah is to start the day after Yom Tov, is as violin akvi as when Yom Tov falt uis b'yem HaShabbos, because in a year where Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, Pesach, the first day of Pesach is on Shabbos, and then you start counting Sfira. On Sunday, he does late. Chazal teach that this is a greater perfection in the mitzvah of Sfira, as we'll elaborate in Sifhei. But the point that we need to know for now, is that when we start counting Sfira on Sunday, it's considered more complete. Das heißt, dass die Mitzvah von Sfira ist mit der Chatchile gegeben geworden in zwei Fanen, which means that the mitzvah of Sfira of counting the Omer was given to us in two different scenarios. The Etzem mitzvah von Sfira, was is ma'akiv b'diavad, muss sein in jede Sfira, in was for akviz soll nor sein, is to tzeilu machas hayam tov. The very mitzvah, the mitzvah that can't be not done, is that you start counting from whenever Pesach is. That the day after Pesach, you start counting Sfiras HaOmer. But sometimes there is a kviyus. When Pesach falls on Shabbos and you're starting to count Sfira on Sunday, then the mitzvah from Sfira is with mer shleimus. The mitzvah of Sfira is even more complete than the complete mitzvah being done when Pesach falls out in the middle of the week. Was steht in Torah Mimachas HaShabbos, weil das ist die mitzvah b'chol shleimus. And that's why Torah says Mimachas HaShabbos, Torah is telling us that there's a more complete way of doing it, a most complete way of doing it, even though it's not up to you. When Pesach falls out, it's not up to the person. But Torah is telling us there's two layers to the fulfillment of the mitzvah. When the mitzvah is to count the Omer from the day after Pesach. From whichever day of the week it is, the day after the first day of Pesach, that's when you start counting the Omer. That is the mitzvah. But there is a more shleimus eifin. When Pesach falls out on Shabbos and the Omer begins on the Sfiras Omer begins on Sunday, that is a more shleimus way, and that's why Torah says in Mimachas HaShabbos, not just to be ambiguous about the time when you start, but to tell us that Mimachas HaShabbos is the most perfect way of fulfilling the mitzvah. And Sifei, the Rebbe is going to elaborate on this. The proof to what I'm saying, and the explanation of saying why is the Sunday counting, when the counting starts on Sunday, more shleimus. And then verstehen von der Medrash Tamuah from Pasuk usfartem lechem Mimachas HaShabbos. We'll understand this by first explaining a difficult to understand Medrash on the Pasuk usfartem lechem Mimachas HaShabbos. The pasuk says you start counting from the day after Shabbos. And this is the words of the Medrash. The pasuk says it should be 7 complete weeks. When are they complete? Bizman she'ein Yeshua u'shchanya beinehem. In a time when we don't have the mishmaros, the families of Yeshua and Shchanya serving between Pesach and Shavuos. So Mefarshim explain what is this thing with Yeshua and Shchanya. As this main Bizman she'sefer imachas Shabbos kipshutei von Suntagon. That the Medrash says, Bizman she'ein Yeshua Shchanya b'neihem, it's referring to a year when you start counting Sfiras HaOmer on Sunday, Mimachas Shabbos in the literal sense, und der Medrash git a simin of their kviyus, and the Medrash mentioning Yeshua and Shchanya is giving a simin about to know when Pesach falls on Shabbos, as the Mishmaris Yeshua Shchanya, aber nit getanken aved mikdash mes Pesach latzeres. That it's talking about when Yeshua and Shchanya did not serve in the Beis Hamikdash between Pesach and Shavuos. So just to try to explain this a little bit outside, just to understand what we're talking about. The Mishmaris would come in on Shabbos. Each Mishmar would begin on Shabbos. So if in a year that Pesach falls out on Shabbos, it means that the Chodesh Nisan fell out on Shabbos. So and Chodesh Nisan was the beginning of the rotation of the families. So family number 1, which their name was Yehayariv, would come in on Shabbos or Chodesh Nisan. So I'm not going to go through all the names of the families, but Yeshua and Shchanya were number 9 and 10. So the cheshbon is like this. If the first family came in on the Chodesh Nisan, so that was family 1, the next week was family 2. Now the week Shabbos is Tezvav Nisan. That week there was no Mishmaris because it was Yom Tov. On Yom Tov there was no Mishmaris. So the entire week from Shabbos Tezvav Nisan for the next 7 days until Shvi Yishal Pesach, there was no Mishmaris. So on the day after that, the day after Shvi Yishal Pesach would be Mishmar number 3. So now you have 7 weeks, so 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 6 weeks because the first week was Pesach. And Mishmar 9 and 10 as began on, Shavuos would be on Shabbos. So Mishmar 9 would begin after Shavuos. Again, because you're starting by the Chodesh Nisan Mamish, and you're skipping the week of Pesach, Mishmar number 9, which is the Mishmar of Yeshua, would be right after Shavuos. But if Pesach is in the middle of the week, then the Mishmar would begin the Shabbos before that. So let's say Pesach, let's say the Chodesh Nisan is on a Tuesday. Then the Mishmar would begin on the Shabbos before that. So you're already a few days before Chodesh Nisan begins. Also, the week of Pesach, there was the few days. The Shabbos till Tuesday was 1 Mishmar. Pesach ends on Monday. So then you have from Tuesday to the end of the week another Mishmar. So you're already 2 weeks deeper in. So Yeshua and sometimes even Shchanya, depending on which day of the week it actually started, they would end up working in the Beis Mikdash before Shavuos. So the only scenario that Yeshua and Shchanya begin after Shavuos is only if Pesach falls out on a Shabbos and Chodesh Nisan falls out on a Shabbos. So the Medrash is saying, when is it Tmimos? When Yeshua and Shchanya worked after Shavuos, they're not between Pesach and Shavuos, which is the only case of that. Only scenario is if Chodesh Nisan is on a Sunday, if Pesach is on a Sunday. Then you start, on a Shabbos, then you start counting on Sunday. That is Tmimos. When you start counting Sfira after Shabbos, then the weeks are complete because they're following the same schedule, the same weeks as the weeks of creation. But if Yeshua is coming in between Pesach and Shavuos, then it's not Tmimos, because that means that the Sfiras HaOmer started somewhere in the middle of the week. Is Tamua. So this is a very fundamental aspect that the Gemara is the Medrash is explaining. When is it Tmimois? You only really have Tmimois if you start accounting on a Sunday. It's Tamua. And this is why the Rebbe says it's a Medrash Tamua. It's a question. The Chiyuv in from Tmimois is B'chol Shana Shana. Sheva Shabbos, as the pasuk says, you should count 7 complete weeks. This obligation exists every year. But Yeder Kfiyus, whatever the calendar says. Which is why if you forgot to count, you can't count anymore because it's not Tmimois. You have to have Tmimois, and if you missed a day, you lost your Tmimois, so you can't make a bracha. Sfiras Eimer is mi be'erev, and this is why we start counting in the evening, because you want to have a complete 7 weeks, and everything in Torah begins from the evening. So why does the Medrash say that the only time you can have Tmimois is if Pesach falls on Shabbos? Seemingly by saying Machas Shabbos and by saying that you only have Tmimois if you're starting to count on Sunday, this leaves room to make the error of the Baitusim that Sfira would start on Sunday every year, even if Pesach wasn't on Shabbos. Is there beer in them? So the explanation is, why does the Torah say Machas HaShabbos? Why does the Torah say that Tmimois is only if Sfira begins on Sunday? Is there beer in them? When you have the complete weeks in a way that we're starting on a Sunday, then you have the Tmimois, you have complete weeks in the most complete possible way. But this shleimus is not indispensable. You could still be yotze the mitzvah without the shleimus. Tmimus liikuva is memtes yom. The tmimus that you can't be without is 49 days, regardless of when it starts. Aber shleimus not tmimus is when says Shabbos. But the most complete possible way of tmimus is when it follows the week. Follows the order of the week, which means that you start counting on Sunday and you're counting Laksheshis and Ibreshis, which is only when Pesach falls on Shabbos. So we still have to go back to the concept of Shemitah and why the Zohar says it seems to imply that the Eved goes out in the year of Shemitah. But what we now understand is that within a mitzvah itself, there is a concept of Shleimus and a concept of not so bishleimus. And B'Sfiras Omer, that's why the Torah says in Machas HaShabbos, even though you could fulfill the mitzvah, whenever, mitzvah of counting the Omer, and even having the idea of Tmimois, when Pesach, whatever day Pesach falls out, but when you have, what does the Medrash mean? Eimosai hein Tmimois. When do you have the Tmimois b'shleimus? That's when you're counting according to the days of the week, when you're starting to count on Sunday, when Pesach is Chol b'Shabbos, and that's why Torah says Machas HaShabbos, because Torah is describing to us the most perfect way of fulfilling this mitzvah. And if this is true, that Torah sometimes speaks about a mitzvah in the most complete possible way, with all of its details, even though not all the details are indispensable. This will also help us understand something about the end of the Omer, which is Chag HaShavuos. With regards to the day of Shavuos, when does it fall out? Which day on the calendar? So Chazal tell us, sometimes it's on the 5th day of Sivan, sometimes on the 6th day of Sivan, sometimes on the 7th day of Sivan. This is referring to the time when they would be Mekadosh al Pi Hariyah. The new month would begin based on the sighting of the new moon. So now like this, if Chodesh Iyar and Chodesh Nisan and Iyar both have 29 days, then Shavuos will be on Zayin Sivan, because Shavuos is always the 50th day from the Omer. So it's based on Pesach. So if Nisan and Iyar only have 29 days, then you have to wait till the 7th of Sivan to do Shavuos. If both Nisan and Iyar had 30 days, then by Hey Sivan is already 49 or 50 days from Pesach, and you would do Shavuos on Hey Sivan. And if, like we have now, where the calendar is already pre-established, that Nisan is 30 days. Nisan is 30 days and Iyar is 29 days. Then Shavuos falls out on Vav Sivan, 50 days after the beginning of Sfiras HaOmer is Vav Sivan. As Chag Shavuos muss nicht allemal sein, bis manchmal katschen al Piriya b'yematen teresenu, which would mean that Shavuos would not, when they were being Mekadesh, when they were beginning the new months, sanctifying the months according to the sighting of the moon, it's possible that Shavuos will not be on the day of the giving of the Torah, versus B'shisha to B'shiva B'Sivan, which is either on the 6th or the 7th day of Sivan, which is separate machlokes. But let's say, for example, following the opinion as we do that Shavuos was on, the Torah was given on the 6th of Sivan. There are some years that Shavuos is actually on Hey Sivan, which is not the day, or Zayin Sivan, which is not the day that the Torah was given. Is a Duadit Miyah B'zeh, which implies from this, which is implied by this, that when you celebrate Shavuos and when we receive the Torah are not intrinsically connected. You could celebrate Shavuos even on a day that the Torah wasn't given. Is a Duadit Miyah B'zeh. So the question on this is known. When gefindt, as Chazal verbinden dem Tag von Shavuos mit Tag Matan Torah. We find that the Chazal do connect the day of Matan Torah and the day of Shavuos. Wir sagt in Yerushalmi, besides the fact that we say Zman Matan Torah Seinu, etc., etc., but in addition to that, we find in the Yerushalmi, as the town was by the Karbonis von Atzeres, steht nicht in Pasuk der Loshen Chet. The reason that when it comes to the Karbonis in Parshas Pinchas, when it discusses the Karbonis of Shavuos, it says, it does not use the word Chet. The Pasuk often in other Pesach time, for example, it says Usir chatos echad lechaper aleichem. Usir izim chatos echad lechaper aleichem. Mentions the word chatos. By Shavuos it says Seir izim echad lechaper aleichem. It doesn't say the word chatos. As they were kabbanas from the Andri Yom Tevim. Is Mikiva shekivat aleichem el Torah, says the Yerushalmi, because on this day you accepted upon yourself the yoke of Torah. I'm considering it as if you've never sinned. In other words, every single year, it's as if we are standing by Har Sinai anew, and we have a clean slate. And therefore, the Torah doesn't say the word chait, because we have no chait. But in that case, it means that it's connected. If I'm not saying the word chatos with regards to Shavuos, because it's the day of the giving of the Torah, that means that it's not just the 50th day from Sfiras HaOmer, it's also the day of Kabbalas HaTorah. So why is there this implication with regards to the Kvius, that there's two different things, and therefore you could sometimes celebrate Shavuos not on Yom Nesinas HaTorah, if Chazal clearly connected to, is there Bir Bazah? So using the reasoning that we've been saying till now, that there's an inyan of Shleimus, and there's an inyan of not so b'shleimus, we're going to use the same reasoning with regards to this. The teicha of mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer is the achanas tikvelas HaTorah. What is the theme? What is the underlying theme of Sfiras HaOmer? Is to prepare ourselves to counting of the Omer. K'mevur in Rishonim, as the Rishonim explain, b'shem HaMedrash, as mitzad der Greise der Wartung und Shuka von Yidden tikvelas HaTorah, because the Yidden were so eager and so and yearning to receive the Torah. So from when they went out of Mitzrayim, they counted the days as they got closer and closer to receiving the Torah. The 49 days of counting the Omer, are the preparation to count to receiving the Torah on the 50th day. And from the Hasidic perspective, by counting 49 days, which correspond to the 49 gates of Bina, of levels of accomplishment, you could reach the 50th level, the 50th day, but Dustin of Matan Torah, which is the idea of Matan Torah. In other words, not just were they counting days till they received the Torah, they were actually preparing themselves. They were elevating themselves until they would be on a level that they could be worthy and ready to receive the Torah. Kumtois. So clearly, the counting of the Omer is a preparation to, not just to get to the 50th day, but to Kabbalas HaTorah, because the counting of the Omer was a hachana to Kabbalas HaTorah. Kumtois, as afal pi as the inyan hasfir is nikul gwan and lefen as yem chamishim mus nito is found in the talk of Kabbalas HaTorah, which means this tells us that even though the way Sfira is established, it's possible that the 50th day would not be on the day of Kabbalas HaTorah. Noch mer ken zayin lifnei Kabbalas HaTorah, it could even be on Hey Sivan, which is before the receiving of the Torah. In other words, at least on the seven on Zion Sivan, you could say I already have the Torah, so I'm celebrating having the Torah. On Hey Sivan, I don't even have the Torah yet, so I'm celebrating. I can't celebrate Kabbalas HaTorah even before I got the Torah. Von deswegen, nevertheless, then not said as Imach Hamishim falt yet oisen them talk from Kabbalas HaTorah. But even though the way the Torah established it is that I could do Shavuos, even on the day that I didn't receive the Torah. Nevertheless, when it does work out that Shavuos falls out on the day of Kabbalas HaTorah, it does need nor azacha davar study, so it's not an extra detail that is not relevant, not necessary. Nor ashleimus and atzeres gufa. It actually brings the day of Shavuos to a greater sense of perfection because it's corresponding also with Yom Kabbalas HaTorah. The shleimus from Yom HaChamishim is when there's the talk from Kibbutz Lechem El Torah Matan Torah. The ultimate, most perfect way of doing Shavuos is when it is the same day during which we accepted upon ourselves the yoke of Torah. And since the complete version, the Shleimus version of Shavuos is when it falls out on the day of receiving the Torah. The Rebbe sagt, the Yerushalmi steht nicht in Torah, therefore says the Yerushalmi that the Torah does not say the word chet, because we're talking about Yom Kabbalas HaTorah, because that is the most perfect way of doing it. Just like the Torah says, even by Sfiras Omer, even though there are other ways of doing it, because the perfect, most way of doing it is when the most shleimus is when Pesach falls out on Shabbos. So too, the most perfect way of doing Shavuos is when Shavuos falls out on Yom HaChamishim, or when Yom HaChamishim falls out on Yom Kabbalas HaTorah. And therefore the Torah doesn't say the word chet, because that's the most perfect way that's the most perfect kvius. While we're on this line, where we're discussing the concept of the lechatchila and b'diavad, or the shleimus, or the not shleimus of a specific mitzvah, in Sif Zayin, the Rebbe is going to introduce that there are sometimes two mitzvahs with a similar theme, but one is a more shleimusdike version, a more complete version of that mitzvah, and one is a more secondary version of that same mitzvah. Just as we say with regards to one specific mitzvah. Similarly, we find two mitzvahs which have a similar theme. As an a mitzvah is a mitzvah, then one of them, the way we do it, the way it's done, is with more shleimus, or is with shleimus, is in a totally complete way. Mitzvah, it does not be shleimus, whereas by the other version of this mitzvah is not as complete. For example, the mitzvah of Schidas Mitzrayim, to remember the exodus from Mitzrayim, from Egypt. Which consists of two separate mitzvahs. Number one, the obligation to tell the story of going out of Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach, the 15th of Nisan, and secondly, and the mitzvah of remembering the going out of Mitzrayim every day of the year. Even though both of these mitzvahs have the same theme, to remember the going out of Mitzrayim, there are various differences in how you fulfill this mitzvah. Because when you do the remembrance of going out of Mitzrayim during the rest of the year, it does not consist of all the details, and is not as emphasized as the remembrance of going out of Mitzrayim that's done on the night of Pesach. Number 33, the Rebbe references the Rebbe's Haggadah, in which the differences are discussed, and I'll mention a couple of them. On Pesach, it has to be done b'dibur. You have to remember Yitzhak Mitzrayim by speaking, saying the words, whereas during the rest of the year, it's enough to remember it in your heart. Another difference is that on the night of Pesach, it has to be said as a story, whereas during the rest of the year, you just have to say you don't even have to say the words. But even if you're saying the words, you just say the words. The remembering the going out of Mitzrayim, you don't have to tell it as a story. Another example is that on Pesach, it's supposed to be said as an answer, as an answer to the question, either of the child or of someone else who asks the question. Another difference is that according to the Mishnah in Brachas, in the first period of Brachas, According to Ben Zayma, the mitzvah of Zchiras, Yitzias Mitzrayim, is not going to be applicable in the everyday when Mashiach comes. Whereas the mitzvah of Pesach is going to continue even after Mashiach comes. So we see that Pesach is done differently, and Pesach is longer term, and has many more details to it. So you have the mitzvah of Yitzias, the mitzvah of Zchiras Yitzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach, which is much more emphasized and consists of many more details. Whereas the mitzvah of remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim every day is on a lesser level. And the reason for that is very simple. There's the actual time when the Yidden learned Mitzrayim was on the night of what began on the night of Tezvav Nisan. And therefore the remembrance that has to be done on that night has to be in the most complete possible way. Whereas the remembrance that we do the rest of the year is only as an outcome of what happened on the night of Pesach and the chiyuv, the subsequent chiyuv, the obligation of that night. Because the idea of Yitzias Mitzrayim has a continuous effect. Therefore, it became a mitzvah to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim every single day of the year. So it's obvious that this remembrance is not going to be with the same sense of completion, the same sense of perfection, because it's only a secondary element to the main event, which was the going out of Mitzrayim that happened on the day of Pesach. So this is another example. We see this concept of b'shleimus and not b'shleimus not only within the same mitzvah, but also within two separate mitzvahs that have a similar theme to them. In Sivches, the Rebbe is going to bring another example, or me'ein dugma now, from something that's not even a mitzvah. But nevertheless, we see that one thing that follows the next, we try to emulate something to the best that we can, even though it's not a perfect imitation. Similar example, we find this in a Mishnah that at first glance seems very, very questionable. There's a Mishnah in Masechta Shkalim that says the following were the Mamunim, were the people in charge of various different things that had to be done in the Beis Mikdash. And the Mishnah rechnet us die Nemen von die Mamunim. And the Mishnah goes on not to say what the jobs were, but also the names of the people who fulfilled those jobs. Und avos for an aved of in Mikdash is jeder verteidigen Mamunim. What the job was, what the name of the person was, and which job he was in charge of. As for example, the Mishnah begins, Yechanim and Pinchas alachei samois. The Yechanim and Pinchas was in charge of this, and the next person was in charge of that, etc., etc. We Mefarshim bring in the Tzvei Perushim, and the Mefarshim say this in two ways, because some of the names that are in this Mishnah were not, they weren't all there. They're not all from the same generation. They're names of people that were there throughout the generations, from when the Beis Mikdash was started until the Mishnah was printed. Was produced. So the Mefarshim explain it in two ways. Either that the Mishnah is mentioning the righteous of each generation, or Beis or in the yeshiva, the various different chachamim that were discussing this, whatever generation they were from, mentioned the ones in their generation that were doing it. So it says Yechanim and Pinchas, because whoever is mentioning it in his time, Yechanim and Pinchas was the guy. And I don't remember all the other names. I don't have the Mishnah in front of me. But whoever it was, so either the Mishnah is mentioning the righteous of each generation, or each person, each Tana was mentioning the names that he knew. Either way, the names in the Mishnah are names from various different generations. Is the Chayre Tamua. The mind of community in the Mishnah Shenyana Halacha, the name from the Munim B'derei Shalfanim. What's the relevance for the Mishnah, which is Halacha, to give us the names of the people of the past? Well, what happened? The fact that in this generation there was Yechanim and Pinchas, and the other generation there was somebody else, what is the halachic relevance to this? So we'll understand this by seeing something that the Rabbeinu Avadi and Bartanura explains on this Mishnah. In other words, because it seems modna it's difficult to understand. Not only why the Mishnah mentions it, but if this generation there was this one, and in that generation there was someone else, then what's the Mishnah telling us? So that Bartanura says like this: as Hamamunim Arishonim shenismanu al kach kacha yishmam. In the first generation, the first time they appointed people for these jobs, these were their names, Yechon ben Pinchas, etc. The fichach nikru abayim achrei mal shmam, and then every single generation, when they brought in a new person to fulfill this job, he had the same name. So the person in charge of the Chaisamais, every year, his name was, every time, every generation, his name was Yechanan ben Pinchas. Why did they do that? Why did they give a guy a name? If he was named Moshe when he was born, why all of a sudden is he named Yechanan? So here's the beer. A name represents the characteristics and the nature of this individual person. Reb Meir would learn something, would be precise about a name. Reb Meir would focus on the name. The fact that these people were chosen for these respective jobs in the Beis Hamikdash is because this job requires a person with specific characteristics. And these characteristics are alluded to in their names. So whatever characteristics are needed for the Chaisamais, Yechanan ben Pinchas had them. How do they know? Because those characteristics are seen in the name Yechanan. And now, in each generation, when you had to appoint a new person for this job, you have to find a person that can have this name, that has the tchunos, that has the characteristics that go along with his name. Der Fun Gufe, was die Bemunim Shalachreise haben gehabt einen anderen Namen, nur Lachreise und Ismanu hat man sie angerufen als Schmam von die Erste. But it wasn't like they found someone that was named Yechanan by his bris. They would look for someone that was good at this job, and then they would give him the name Yechanan. In other words, they would go the other way. Because they knew that he has these characteristics, so therefore, they would give him the name Yechanan. But since we see that at the beginning they were named a different name, and they only received this name after their appointment, is verstandig, as Bazei is blaze given am ein von die Tchunas, it's understood that they only had a small part of those characteristics, aber nicht mit der Shleimus mit die Bemunim v'chavim v'chatchil geisen mit dem Nemen, not with the same level of completion that the original Memunim, original people in charge had this name. So we see a similar concept that initially, the first time around, the people in charge were given this name because that was what represented their talents. Then later on, they found people that had similar talents or something of those talents enough to be given the same name, but not to have been named that from birth. So now we're going to go back to the idea of Shvius. What we've established up until here with various different examples, whether the example of Lechatchila and B'di'evet, whether the examples of Shleimus and less Shleimus that we see with regards to Sfira, that we see with regards to Shavuos, that we see with regards to Schiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, and that we see with regards to the names of the Memunim in the Beis Hamikdash, we will now be able to apply this to the concept of Sfira and to the Tush of Shvius, and we'll understand what the Zohar is saying, that because the earth is resting, therefore the Eved Ivri has to rest in his 7th year. As we said with regards to remembering in Tzis Mitzrayim, that there is a way it's done b'shleimus, which is on the night of Pesach, and there's a way that it's done with less shleimus the rest of the year. Is al derech zed der biur and divrei hazoyar. Similarly, we'll explain the words of the Zohar when it gets to Shana Shvius. Es is da di Shana Shvius from Klal Yisrael. Shnas Shmita. There's the 7th year. That's the 7th year for the whole Klal Yisrael, which is the year of Shvita. Which is Faran di Shana Shvius from Yachid, and then an individual could have his own 7th year. The 7th year after he was sold as an Eved. Since both are the 7th, is verstandig as beide aber tzad hashava. It's understood that both have a common underlying theme. Especially in the case we're talking about an Eved Ivri who is a Yid, so he's a part of Klal Yisrael. So therefore, there's going to be a connection between his personal Shvius and the Shvius that he observes as part of Klal Yisrael. Now the Chilik doesn't say is, but there's a difference. When is the 7th year of all of Klal Yisrael? The idea that it's a Shabbos LaHashem, a resting time for Hashem, then it's in a sense of it's in a more complete way. Und der Rebbe brings ihm sich die alle halachas von Shemitah, which is why there's a lot of halachas of Shemitah with regards to not working the land and with regards to giving back loans, etc., because it's Shabbos LaHashem, the whole Klal Yisrael and the whole Eretz Yisrael is uplifted like it's like a Shabbos. But when it's the 7th year of a private individual, is blois am ein from the Shabbos LaHashem v'shnas Shemitah. It's only a small part of the Shabbos LaHashem that we have in Shemitah. When the Rebbe does blaze in seiner Reiskin l'chav shechinam, therefore he doesn't have to observe all the halachas of Shemitah. It only expresses itself in the fact that he himself goes free. And that's what the Zohar is saying. That when the earth is resting, the Eved has to rest. Doesn't mean that it's happening at the same time that he goes out in the year of Shemitah. When the Zohar means to say, an Eved the Eved has to go out on the 7th year of his sale, because he belongs to the general Klal Yisrael, and therefore in his 7th year of when he was sold, he observes a piece of the naicha, of the resting that happens for the all of Klal Yisrael on the 7th year of Shemitah. Because since in his 7th year he's experiencing somewhat of the naicha, the resting that takes place in the year of Shemitah, therefore he himself also gets a rest and he goes out free. So in other words, it's like B'machas HaShabbos. B'machas HaShabbos is the best way it could be done, but nevertheless it can be done in other ways too. Similarly, the naicha da'ara is the full-fledged naicha, but the person on his shana hashvius, he experiences that naicha da'ara to some degree, enough that he has to go out free. That's what the Zohar is saying. He goes out free because he's tapping into the energy of the naicha da'ara that happens in Shemitah. Now, and this explains the Zohar. But the Rebbe is now going to add a chiddush. We have to actually look into the Svarim to see if any of the Svarim actually mention this chiddush. When you have both together, the Shana Hashvius of Klal Yisrael and the Shana Hashvius of the Yachid of the individual, when they fall out in the same year, which means the person was bought or was sold in the first year of the 7th-year cycle of Shemitah, and now his 7th year is the same as Shemitah. Naicha de'ara, that the Naicha de'ara is his Naicha, is in the same Naicha de'ara as Shasti Shana Shvius from them Eved Faltus and Tut of Shemitah as Zayin Aruzkin Lachavshi Avdi Naicha so Zayin Betachas Hashlemus. Then you have a most perfect form of Naicha. That his Naicha and the Naicha Dara, his rest, and his 7th year, and the 7th year of the Klal are coinciding, and that's the most perfect way of doing it. The Rebbe then adds, we have to figure out what will be the relevance. What will be the halachic relevance if it falls out in Shemitah or it falls out in a different year? And it's not, and here and now is not the time to elaborate on it. But the Rebbe is being mechadish that there is a more perfect form of the Eved going out when he goes out in the Shnas HaShemitah. Valpiza Yumtak, and with this approach, this will make it more geschmack. But the Zohar sagt be'ofen stommi, that the Zohar says it doesn't detail it. The way the Zohar says it very simply implies that he's talking about the actual year of Shemitah, which is why we asked the question, 1 second, the Eved doesn't go out in Shemitah. So we explained that the Zohar doesn't mean the Shnas HaShemitah. The Zohar means that he's going out in his own 7th year, because he's experiencing me'ena what it's experienced in the Shnas HaShmita. Why does the Zohar imply that we're talking about the Shnas HaShmita? Because the Zohar is trying to bring the most perfect form of it, which is when he actually goes out in Shemitah. Just like we said before about Sfira, that the Torah says because that's the most perfect form of Sfira. So similarly, the Torah, the Zohar says Shemitah stam, but das is when the Shvius the Mechida from the Eved is an Shnas Shemitah be'una Eicha Da'ara. When Shemitah falls out in the 7th year of the Eved, that's the most perfect form of it, and therefore the Zohar refers to it as that time. But obviously, it's not exclusive to that. Whenever it falls out, the Eved goes out in the 7th year limechira, because he is bringing in the energy or the idea of the naicha, the resting of the earth that happens in the Shana Hashvius of Klal Yisrael.